Bob, that was terrific. I'm only sorry that I got us started a little late and that I didn't reserve for dinner because I have so many questions for Bob, but I'm not going to ask them all, obviously, and I know you all have a lot of them. But I will quickly mention two subjects. One, I want to ask you about Whitewater, obviously, and the Clintons. But the other thing that you didn't even get to is that you also managed to defend Clark Clifford in the big case brought by the husband of our last speaker, Lucinda Franks, in the BCCI case. And knowing what we know now about terrorism and the role of BCCI in funding and how it was used by the CIA and the Saudis to fund the likes of holy warriors such as Osama bin Laden, who wasn't then the guy we now know about, I wondered whether Clark Clifford might have known, because it was an intelligence operation that William Casey was running at the CIA and the Defense Department was involved, and it was one of those rare cases where even the best defense lawyer doesn't know everything his client has done, or whether you think he was truly innocent, or whether that whole case looks different now because of sort of this global international conspiracy of finance scene that has evolved.
Well, short answer to that is I don't look at it any differently now than I did then. This was an extremely difficult thing for Clark Clifford. You all know who he was. When he retired from his law firm at age 75, he was asked to take over this bank. So they could rename it called First American Bank. And they had 4 investors from the Middle East. And the Federal Reserve and both in Washington and New York were concerned that BCCI had no involvement with these investors. And Clifford testified that there was no such involvement, that BCCI had no role with these investors. It turned out later that BCCI, in fact, had made loans to these investors, which allowed them to buy the First American stock. And when they defaulted on the loans, BCCI basically had the right to take them over. So BCCI, in effect, had the de facto control of the bank. And so Clifford was in a position, as he said himself, this is a terrible position. I'm either in the position of have to say I lied to the Federal Reserve, or else I was deceived, that I didn't know this at the time I made the representation. And of course, with his reputation, many people found it hard to believe that anyone could pull the wool over the eyes of someone like Clark Clifford. So he was but when it came out, when you analyzed it, the issue was BCCI controlling this bank. And Clifford showed that BCCI had absolutely no influence on the bank, that the decisions were all made by him and Robert Altman, his deputy, and that BCCI had absolutely no role in that. The Federal Reserve audited it. The auditors audited it and confirmed that BCCI, in fact, had no role in controlling the operations of the bank. And we made that argument to Morgenthau. And we said, there's no evidence here that BCCI was controlling this bank. This bank was run totally independently. No depositor ever lost a penny. The bank was extremely successful. It became far more successful under Clifford and Altman than it had ever been before. And there was no evidence whatsoever that BCCI had anything to do with it. And we made that point to Morgenthau. We went in and we had a meeting, and he had 4 people in the room. His top assistant, he had 3 top people that were sort of his counsel. One of them was a man named Michael Cherkasky, later became head of Kroll. And the other 2 were John Moscow, who was the prosecutor, who was really out to get Clifford, and 2 of his deputies. Cherkasky told us after the presentation, you persuaded me. I told Morgenthau we shouldn't bring this case. The other 2 guys, Moscow said you should bring it. Morgenthau went with Moscow, and so the case was brought. Clifford was too sick to go to trial. He had 3 heart attacks. He couldn't come to New York for the trial. So the case went to trial against his partner, Robert Altman. But everybody knew, for all practical purposes, that Clifford was on trial in absentia. And Altman had a wonderful defense lawyer, man named Gus Newman. He'd been represented Anthony Anastasio in the Scotto case that I prosecuted, a very savvy, experienced criminal defense lawyer. Case went on 4 months. At the end of the prosecution's case, the judge dismissed all the bribery charges. As a matter of law, there wasn't enough evidence of that. The case went to the jury. They not only brought in an acquittal, the jury foreman burst into tears when she delivered the verdict. The jury burst into applause and then went out and hugged all the members of Altman's family. So we felt that, we were right. This was a case that should not have been brought, and nothing has happened since then to change my opinion.
I guess we still would disagree about that one. I think this is the overriding question before I throw it open. And I hate to make it more than one part, but I will. Is there anything that you wanted to tell the press about Whitewater as it was going on? But more important, is there anything that you learned during that investigation that, in your opinion, now would in any way color your judgment or disqualify Hillary Clinton from being a presidential candidate?
The answer to that is no.
During the Vince Foster investigation, which I totally agree with, well, yes, we are.
It's not a one-on-one.
You're right, Tony. Did Vince Foster kill himself because the Clintons were driving him crazy?
There was no evidence of that, no. I'm sorry, anybody else?
Jerry? Here, wait, Jerry, take the mic, and then you can pass it around. Please identify yourselves for Bob here. Turn it on.
Okay. Jerry Eskenazi, I was with the New York Times.
You're a hockey writer, right?
Yes.
I was a hockey player.
1968. When you took the oath of office or when you left, are there any restrictions that you had in terms of, because of your position, about what you can speak of in later years because of the possibility of, I don't know, cases being overturned or being reviewed again?
Well, they're the same restrictions that were there when I was in the position. I mean, anything we learned through the grand jury is protected by Rule 6E. But other than that, I have no more restrictions now than I did then, other than what I choose to exercise in my own discretion.
Tell us why you were replaced as special counsel, and how do you feel about it, and what went wrong?
Well, what happened was, I'll say first of all, there was an order that was issued by the three-judge court. And you may remember that I said when the Republicans and the Democrats were first urging Janet Reno to make an appointment, she said, I don't want to do that because someone will claim that whoever I appoint has an appearance of a lack of independence. And that was the reasoning in the order that came down from the three-judge court. It said something like, we have no quarrel with Mr. Fiske, his abilities, his integrity, or what he's done, but we think that anybody that was appointed by the Attorney General who reports to the President may have a lack of appearance of independence, so we think we should start with our own person, and that's how they picked Ken Starr. That's the rationale. I have no personal knowledge of any other reason.
Well, you must
I
have
wasn't
been
privy to the deliberations.
You must have been really pissed.
I was, and I said I was, and I say in the book I was very angry because I said I'm like the guy that's carried the ball to the 2-yard line, and the guy comes in with a clean uniform and takes it into the end zone. There had been a lot of criticism when I came down with the first 2 reports. Vince Foster committed suicide, and there's no obstruction of justice between the White House and the Treasury. Conclusion Ken Starr also reached later. But when those first came out, a lot of the conservatives were attacking that, saying, what's wrong with this guy? He's not aggressive enough. We need somebody that's going to be more aggressive. And there were senators that were openly lobbying the three-judge court to replace me for that reason. And so that's what I found frustrating. I said, I'm not aggressive enough. I've only been here 5 months. I've got 8 indictments that are ready to go, including the Deputy Associate Attorney General of the United States and the Governor of Arkansas. That's not aggressive enough in 5 months, but I never had a chance to prove that. That's what I found that very frustrating.
One follow-up. Do you think Ken Starr overreached?
I've said from day one that I've been asked hundreds of times to comment on the different things that he did or didn't do, and I've always said, I'm just not going to comment on his investigation. And I don't think I'll start now. Thank you anyway.
Well, who else has a question? I know, Bob, you talked about Joanne Harris. She was very critical of the Monica Lewinsky aspects of the investigation, which of course were after your time. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I have an enormous respect for her, and her report first came out in a wonderful book, I'm sure many of you read it, called The Death of American Virtue by the Dean of the Duquesne Law School, Professor Ken Gormley. It's about 800 pages long. It takes a while to get through it, but it's a brilliant book. And that's the first time I read about this special investigation that she was asked to conduct. I've never talked to her about it. I've never read her report exactly, but she concluded there was no obstruction of justice or no violation of any ethical rules, but I think she said she would have done it differently.
Bill Deal, ABC News Radio. Back in the 70s, when you talked a lot about what was going on back then, there was no Google, there was no TMZ, no email trails. Do you think things would have been different had we had that kind of situation back then with lots of emails and people looking at all of the little things that were going on back then?
Well, I'll give you an easy answer to that. Knowing Alfred Taubman as well as I do, he doesn't use email. So if they had email then, he wouldn't have used it. So, but the one thing I do think we found very frustrating is that the theory of the case was that Taubman had met with his counterpart at Christie's, the chairman of Christie's, a man named Alfred Tennant, and they agreed on a broad scheme of price fixing, and then had delegated the implementation of that to a man named Davidge at Christie's and Dee Dee Brooks at Sotheby's. And that Dee Dee Brooks and Davidge both testified that they did indeed fix prices, but they did it on the instructions of their superiors. Tennant was in England. He was indicted, but he couldn't be extradited. But the most damaging piece of evidence came in from a document which Davidge said Tennant had given him, which purported to describe the conversation between Tennant and Taubman, and it came in as, quote, in furtherance of the conspiracy. And it was pretty hard to cross-examine a document. Later on, a writer went over and interviewed Tennant, and Tennant said, you know, that's all wrong. This document really never was a report of that conversation. It was a little bit of this and a little bit of that. They were pieced together, and Davidge was completely wrong. So what I would rather than email, I would have rather had Sir Anthony Tennant in the courtroom to say that. But I don't think email would have made any difference in this case. But I say this, I'm very glad when I was doing the Whitewater investigation that they didn't have the internet the way they do today. It was tough enough at that time. I remember I had said we're going to issue our report on Vince Foster in about 3 weeks. In the next week, I got like 150 postcards from the same place in Orange County saying basically, if you find this is a suicide, it's going to be the biggest cover-up in history. I can only imagine what it would have been like if I had email or the internet.
Okay, anybody else?
Any other questions?
Yeah. Are you watching the Ferguson case, by the way?
I am.
What's going to happen? This looks like it's going to be one hell of a decision one way or another
Yeah, you're right.
in Missouri.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely following that.
Give Ralph the...
Hey, Ralph Blumenthal, I was at the Times, covered the Taubman case.
Yes,
Bob, have you had any dealings with Loretta Lynch, and what do you think of the appointment?
Oh, I think it's a wonderful appointment. I think she's absolutely a first-class person.
You've had dealings with her?
Yes, I have. I'd support that with great enthusiasm.
It's an easy one.
Thank you.
No, I guess, any other questions? I wanted to ask you one last one. One of your aces in Little Rock was now a famous defense attorney named Rusty Hardin. Does he ever call you up and say, what am I going to do about this Roger Clemens mess I'm in the middle of?
Actually, I did talk to Rusty Hardin. And back at the time when the Mitchell report first came out, and there was a question of what was Clemens going to do. And Rusty has gotten some criticism from lawyers that said, how could you ever let Clemens go public like that? And how could you expose him to testimony in Congress and perjury prosecution, even though Rusty got him acquitted in the trial? And what was going on, if you watch Roger Clemens, nobody is going to tell Roger Clemens what to do. And Roger Clemens was adamant, I never did this, and I'm going to say so, and I'm going to say so publicly. And probably the most dramatic illustration of that was he held a press conference right afterwards, and he's talking about how he's innocent, the Mitchell report is wrong, and there are reporters that are clearly hostile to him and skeptical, and one of them says, well, aren't you really worried about whether you're going to get into the Hall of Fame? And Clemens turns beet red and says, I don't give a rat's ass about the Hall of Fame. And you can see, and it's his video, Rusty writes him a note, and he hands him the note. Clemens looks at the note and says, lighten up. I'm not going to lighten up. So there's no way anyone was going to tell Roger Clemens that he wasn't going to go public with his position. And in the end, he was vindicated in the trial. And I went down and watched part of that, Rusty try that case. He's a hell of a trial lawyer, and he did a great job.
Okay, I hope you all come, and here's Bob's book, terrific book. And my final question is, since you were an old NFL attorney, what would you tell them to do about how to handle domestic violence?
I didn't get the question. Who would I tell
Question
what?
was, how would you counsel the National Football League these days about how to handle the issue of domestic violence?
It absolutely can't be tolerated. I mentioned I started talking about Michigan. Michigan's second, probably one of their best defensive players, who basically won the game in Northwestern by sacking the quarterback who was going for a 2-point conversion when the score was 10-9, a man named Frank Clark. He's the star of the Michigan defense, probably a top-ranked NFL draft choice. They had last weekend off. He went back to his house in Ohio and was arrested for beating up his girlfriend. And Michigan kicked him off the team. And that's absolutely what you have to do. This absolutely cannot be tolerated.
Thank you very much. That was just terrific, as I fully anticipated. So don't forget, December 10th, Sandy Sokolow, come on up and get the book. Let me open the boxes. Bob, thank you. You were really great.
Thanks.
I hope that wasn't too arduous.
No, not at all.